How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most lost podcast in the world. We are your hosts, as always, myself, Mickey T.
And me, Nostalgia.
And welcome to another edition of our album recap series. Today we're going to be covering a lot of the noteworthy releases that we felt were necessary from June. We have well over 20 albums to cover here, and there's some big releases, some releases that you might want to check out yourself. Y'all know how this works by now. I think we'll just stop waffling and get right into the first album. So, first album we're going to be talking about today is Blue Weekend by Wolf Alice. This is the third studio album from the UK alternative rock and dream pop band. Up until this point, I haven't given any of Wolf Alice's work a listen since I've only heard about them when this new album came out, and since it's been released, it's garnered a lot of praise and critical acclaim. So I was curious to see what the buzz was about for Blue Weekend. And I've listened to it a few times, and each time I've listened to it, I've come away even more confused as to why this album is being hyped up to the degree that it was. Since I just don't find much about it to be that interesting. In fact, I find it to be pretty mediocre for what it is. I suppose I can understand its appeal as a vibey album, but for me, this was just so nondescript, bland, and uninspired. None of the tracks have any qualities about them that make them stand out to me, and I just found a lot of the production on this thing to be so dull and lifeless. To give some credit where it's due, I get the appeal. I think there's a couple of decent tracks in here, and there's some solid hooks here and there. But that's it really, because I didn't find much else enjoyable or memorable about it. For one, I think the album's reverb-soaked atmospheres are so dull, and if you took away that from the tracks, then we get this skeletal mess of unfocused and derivative ideas. Some of the mixes on this thing can be very sloppy as well, and a bit overcompressed. And while I definitely like the variety of sounds they explore, none of them are sonically fulfilling. I found the vocals to be incredibly derivative, dull and nondescript as well. I felt like a lot of the songwriting was uninteresting. I really didn't like the more rock-tinged songs on this, as I just found them to be obnoxious, and generally speaking, I just didn't really like much of anything this album presented. Yeah, as much as I tried, it just didn't click with me. It was just such a derivative and dull mess from front to back, and while I can certainly respect and see the appeal, and those who enjoy the album, I'm fine with saying it's probably the most overrated album I've heard this year.
My opinions differ a little because I did really enjoy this project. I think that at its finest moments, Blue Weekend delivers incredible and melancholic tracks, and it's an album that is overall a bit less noisy and a bit more dreamy than their previous material. A direction which I think seems very fitting for the group at this point in their career, in my opinion. Tracks like Delicious Things or Lipstick on a Glass are some of the best the band has to offer, and are definitely among some of the many highlights this album has to offer. But unfortunately, I do think this album isn't particularly consistent all the way through. I think there are some moments here where the more ethereal style is less atmospheric than it is just rather sluggish. These moments aren't exactly commonplace, but they definitely do happen enough to bring the record down a notch for me. Overall, I still think it's a very good album, and I still think it's got plenty of highlights that are worth sticking around for, but I don't necessarily think its consistency is one of its strong points. I think it definitely does show that it can, deliver an underwhelming track from time to time.
Agree to disagree, I suppose. My favourite tracks from Blue Weekend are The Beach and The Last Man on Earth. My least favourite tracks were Smile and Play the Greatest Hits. And I'm about to get called a Fantano drone because I gave this album a decent 4.
My favourite tracks are Delicious Things, Lipstick on a Glass, Smile, How Can I Make It Okay, Play the Greatest Hits, and Last Man on Earth. My least favourite tracks are Safe from Heartbreak and No Hard Feelings. And I gave this album a light 7 out of 10.
Moving on, we have Jubilee by Japanese Breakfast. This is the third full-length album from indie pop and dream pop singer-songwriter Michelle Zauner, aka Japanese Breakfast. Now, prior to the announcement of Jubilee, I wasn't that well versed in the Japanese Breakfast discography or their brand of indie pop and dream pop. I haven't heard much of anything she's done prior, but I did go ahead and listen to her other albums prior to my first few listens of Jubilee, and I was personally very lukewarm on a lot of her work. The ideas were certainly there, but a lot of it just didn't really feel all that tuneful, and I wasn't a fan of the production. But I still went into this new album, Jubilee, with some optimism, and while it didn't blow me away, I thought it was a very good dream pop album. In contrast with her previous work, I think that Japanese Breakfast has improved on numerous fronts. Nearly every track on Jubilee feels very well put together and better produced. The songs on Jubilee feel much more memorable, engaging and fleshed out. The vibrant, breezy, and light sound of the album works well with Michelle's vocal style. I like the tracks on here that have dashes of extra instrumentation, and I won't deny that there's some incredibly infectious melodies and sounds throughout its duration. It feels like it has a bit of a throwback flair as well, but it still feels very grounded in its dream pop aesthetic, and there are some amazing highlights to be found in the album. Not to mention the songwriting and the performances have gotten so much better as well, with some incredibly well-written lyrics and very emotive vocals and performances, which often elevates the tracks when they're at their best. While I definitely enjoy the album as a whole, I do have some minor nitpicks. For one, I feel like there's a few tracks in this thing that feel just way too breezy for my liking, and they end up coming off a little bland. There's almost moments on Jubilee that feel a little unstructured and unfocused, and that kind of takes me out of some tracks. And with those tracks in mind, that leaves some inconsistencies overall. Outside of that though, it's a very enjoyable album, has some fantastic tracks under its name, and despite its flaws, it works for what it is. It's easily Japanese breakfast's best album in my opinion, and if you love yourself some dream pop and indie pop, then go ahead and give this a go. I recommend it.
I think there's a lot of things you could praise Japanese breakfast discography up to this point for. It's proven to be more than enough to establish Michelle's honor as a household name in the contemporary dream pop scene, along with bands like Always and Beach House. But in my honest opinion, I don't think that her career has been particularly impactful. I think that she's consistently released very good stuff, but stuff that didn't quite test the boundaries of the genre confines, and it didn't quite do enough to put Michelle's name up there with the aforementioned Beach House or Always. But I do think that Jubilee is a bit of a different beast altogether. Firstly, I think calling this album simply a dream pop record is doing it a massive disservice. I think Michelle really turned her creativity up a lot when it comes to the overall sound palette of this project. It's still got the nostalgic kiss dream pop overtones of her previous works, but with far more eclectic and far more plentiful influences throughout. She especially embraces a lot of chamber pop sounds and even a lot of sunshine pop sounds. The atmosphere and aesthetic of this album is also, very much sunshine pop. It's very summery, very breezy. The instrumental work here is fantastic. It's so lush. It's very tasteful, and it adds a lot to the raw emotion and sentimentalism of the music itself. I think Michelle's songwriting really strikes me as just very mature on this project. It's easily her best written project to date, and it's also the project where the music allows the lyrics to shine the most, in my opinion. She not only manages to keep her sound fresh on Jubilee, but she also establishes herself as quite the versatile musician. This is easily my favorite Japanese breakfast album, and it's a massive step forward artistically for Michelle, and I think it's absolutely brilliant.
I agree. My favorite tracks from Jubilee are Posing in Bondage, Paprika, Slide Tackle, Sit, Tactics, and Posing for Cars. My least favorite track is Be Sweet, and I gave this album a decent 7.
Jesus, I disagree with that. My favorite tracks are Paprika, Be Sweet, Kokomo, Slide Tackle, Posing in Bondage, In Hell, Tactics, and Posing for Cars. I do not have a least favorite track. I gave this album a decent 8 out of 10.
Okay. Moving on to the next album, we have The Voice of the Heroes by Lil Baby and Lil Durk. This is the first collab album from Atlanta rapper Lil Baby and Chicago rapper Lil Durk. Both rappers I'm not really fans of, if I'm being honest. I've heard a few of Lil Baby's projects, but nothing that the guy has ever done has really impressed me. He has some good songs, but his delivery and production choices don't help. And as far as Lil Durk is concerned, he's okay. I haven't heard a project from him, but from the features that I've heard and a few of the songs I've heard, he just seemed like another run-of-the-mill trap rapper. So with that in mind, I wasn't very hyped or that interested in checking out this project, but alas, the podcast grind must continue, and wouldn't you know, I didn't care for Voice of the Heroes. This album just isn't that interesting on a lot of fronts, really. It almost has nothing to really take note of or write home about, except maybe a few flows and a few good tracks here and there. Outside of that, it just suffers from so many tropes that trap albums normally suffer from. For one, the production is absolutely generic, samey, uninspired, and pretty unremarkable. I swear, most of these beats just sound exactly the same. Either that or I was just too bored to take any notice or see any differentiation. Either way, it's not interesting. You know, the track list is bloated unnecessarily. It's got 18 tracks. It's an hour long. Why? There's no reason for it to be as long as it is. And the lads don't exactly justify its length, and it's not fun to listen to every single one when it's mostly the same. When it comes to Lil Baby and Lil Durk themselves, I won't say that they don't deliver on mostly subpar performances. In fact, I think Lil Baby has improved a lot and has really slick moments. Lil Durk also has his moments, but I much prefer Lil Baby's contributions. You know, they do feel a little one-dimensional, but they have their moments. I also think there's a few alright tracks, but I found a lot of this album to be pretty mediocre and underwhelming. I'd say about 60% of the album for me was just mediocre and underwhelming, and overall I just found this album to be underwhelming.
Yeah, underwhelming's one way to put it. I think Voice of the Heroes is almost formulaically crafted to be the most unmemorable album imaginable. I think both Lil Baby and Lil Durk sound completely lifeless on most of these tracks. Everything sounds so mind-numbingly repetitive and just redundant that it's really hard for any track to stand out, really. Either negatively or positively, to be honest. It's just all kind of in between. The instrumentals and performances overall could not have brought less exciting stuff to the table, in my opinion. It's just another unnecessarily bloated generic trap rap album. Nothing really to add to the genre, nothing to say about it, really. I feel like both artists are capable of at least a bit more. I think this project just seems a little half-arsed throughout.
Yeah. My favourite tracks from The Voice of the Heroes are Medical, 2040, and How It Feels. The worst tracks are Who I Want, Still Hood, Man of My Word, That's Facts, Rich Off Pain, and Bruised Up, and I gave this album a strong 4.
My favourite track is Hats Off, my least favourite track is Medical, and I give this album a light 4.
Okay, next we have Butterfly 3000 by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. This is the 18th studio album from the Australian psych rock band, and Butterfly 3000 is coming out not too long after their last album, LW, which was a sister album to 2020's KG. Both of those records saw King Giz try and delve a bit further into microtonality and experiment a little bit more on it. And I feel like those last two records were just pretty much fine for what they were. They were just lesser successors to Flying Microtonal Banana, and the exploration into microtonality was getting a little tiresome. So I was hoping that they would move on to something different with the next album, which they did. The band did move on to something else, and this time they've decided to dip their toes into the bright world of indie electronica. You know, this prospect was pretty exciting to hear, as King Giz have made good electronic tracks in the past, and it would be interesting to see how they could do it on a full album setting. And I can respect it for being a pleasant album, but I think the band haven't really explored the ideas presented on here to their full potential. Now, I do think that the production is very good. I think that the band managed to create some very lush, neo-psychedelic soundscapes with some very playful and bright synths. I think that they coincide with the more organic instrumentation very well, and it does a very good job of being very catchy. It certainly has some tracks that I really enjoy, and the track Blue Morpho stands out as one of the more interesting sonic explorations on the album, given its moody nature and kind of Aphex Twin-esque intro. But where it thrives in being a blissful vibe, it falls flat in being completely creative. As I find a lot of the ideas on Butterfly 3000 to be just way too repetitive for my liking, often to the point where they feel very redundant and sometimes a little rudimentary. Sometimes it even feels like such a slog to sit through given the lack of anything interesting to hold on to. The vocals left a lot to be desired as well. Granted, some of them are catchy at times and the falsetto range works with the more summery soundscapes, but a lot of the vocal lines and hooks are just straight up dull and uninteresting to me. Like I said earlier, there are tracks that I enjoy, and isn't many of them like too... Wait, sorry, what am I saying here? Like I said earlier, there are tracks that I enjoy, but there isn't many of them to enjoy. So it's a little inconsistent on that front, and to summarize Butterfly 3000, it's a pleasant album, and it most certainly is a nice vibe, but it feels like the band could have done so much more and explored so much more to make it interesting.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think a big complaint I had with King Gizzard's last two albums was the lack of new ground the group covered both stylistically and creatively. I think both albums are a bit too similar. They both saw them explore a microtonic and Anatolian rock influenced sound that, mind you, they had already explored in the past on Flying Microtonal Banana, without really adding anything new to the formula, which is something that is completely out of character for King Gizzard. They have long been known to be one of the most eclectic and ever-changing bands around. But I can safely say that this isn't an issue on Butterfly 3000. I think the group attempt an almost Animal Collective-esque indie-tronica approach to their psychedelic sound. And while I appreciate this change-up in sound, obviously, I think the project as a whole just doesn't really do much for me. I think King Gizzard never really half-ass a style when they do it. If they commit to it, they commit to it. And while they certainly do commit to it here, they really don't add anything new to the sound to make it truly their own. They just don't fully send it, in my opinion. I think they seem, for once in their career, they seem kind of not in their comfort zone. It doesn't feel like this is, a sound that particularly suits King Gizzard, as weird as that sounds. It doesn't sound like the group are completely out of it. I mean, there's definitely some really good elements on here. There's some really good moments, some really catchy moments. It's just that this project has a lot of tracks that are very much capable of just boring me to death. I don't think all of the tracks here are particularly consistent. And I, think that Butterfly 3000 as a whole just feels like one of the most undercooked new ideas the band has explored. It's definitely not a bad album, but it's definitely not up there with any of their best albums, and in comparison to some of their best albums, it seems a little lost.
Yeah, I can agree. My favourite tracks from Butterfly 3000 are Yours, Interior People, and Butterfly 3000. My least favourite tracks are Dreams, Black Hot Soup, and Yeah Love, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favourite tracks are Shanghai and Catching Smoke. My least favourite tracks are Dreams and Yeah Love, and I give this album a light 5 out of 10.
Next up, we have Path of Wellness by Sleater-Kinney. This is the 10th studio album from the indie rock and punk rock band. Path of Wellness is also the first Sleater-Kinney album that I'm hearing as well. I've seen their name getting thrown around when it came to a lot of 2000s indie rock and 90s Riot Girl, but I've never gotten the chance to check out their music until now with this new album. Now, there's definitely things that I can appreciate Path of Wellness for, but as an entire album experience, it isn't that good. In fact, I'm pretty indifferent towards it. Honestly, there's just very little to say about this album. It just doesn't really have much about it that's interesting or much about it that's memorable. Calling it bad would be way too harsh. Calling it good would be way too generous. Hell, even calling it decent would be a reach. It's just an average rock album overall. Now, it has a few minor moments that I thought were a little catchy, but I found a lot of this to be very dull and uninspired. Instrumentation is dry, the riffs are basic, the whole atmosphere is low energy and flat, the guitar leads are so dull, and the tracks that feature more punk and Riot Girl energy aren't all that memorable, even if they break up the monotony. I could certainly respect some of the songwriting as well, but there's just not a lot to hold on to instrumentally since it's so dead from front to back. Overall, not a bad album, has some catchy moments, but none of it is either memorable or engaging.
I want to start by apologizing. I'm well aware that my expertise on Sleater-Kinney is far from ideal. I have not heard any of their quote-unquote good back catalogue. The first album I've heard from the band was the 2019 release, The Central Won't Hold, which was a very bland and vapid indie rock album. And the second album I'm hearing from the band is The Path of Wellness, which is also a very bland and vapid indie rock album. I know they used to be good. I've heard that many a times. I promise that I will do my due diligence and listen to those projects when I get the chance. When it comes to this new project, as I said, there's pretty much nothing I can say. I just promise that I will not use this as a marker as to the quality of the group's sound before listening to their previous records. I won't make an opinion just yet. But these albums in a vacuum are just not good. I think they're very, very generic sounding. The production leaves a lot to be desired. The instrumentation is just rather sluggish and boring, and overall it's just some of the most nondescript indie rock imaginable. I don't know what else to say about it.
I will also listen to their good albums too. Okay, so my favourite tracks from Path of Wellness are Tomorrow's Grave and High in the Grass. My least favourite tracks are Down the Line and Favourite Neighbour, and I gave this album a decent 5.
My favourite tracks are Worry With You and Complex Female Characters, and I give this album a decent 4 out of 10.
Next we have Troubled Paradise by Slayyyter. This is the debut full-length album from Missouri pop singer-songwriter Slayyyter. There's been a fair amount of hype on Slayyyter as of late, as her debut mixtape was getting a lot of hype in the hyperpop community, and she teased a lot of singles for this new album, some of which I've heard, some of which I haven't, but either way, it would be interesting to see what she could do on her debut. And after giving it a chance, I don't think that Slayyyter is able to form her own sound or style on this thing in a way that's all that creative, and despite its catchy moments, it does feel pretty derivative. Slayyyter does try to do a fair amount on this album, plenty of sounds such as hyperpop, electropop, house, and bubblegum bass turn up on here, but there's clearly an influence of 2000s pop from the likes of Britney Spears on this thing, and while there's definitely tracks and moments on here that I really enjoy, a lot of the influence just isn't made Slayyyter's. That unfortunately ends up making a lot of these tracks sound very derivative, and it also doesn't help that I'm hearing a lot of her contemporaries in her sound too, particularly those in the PC music camp and people affiliated with the scene like Charlie XCX. The ideas on here just aren't all that refreshing, and a lot of it just sounds very generic to me. However, there were some things that I could take away from it, like a few of the songs on here that I thought were very enjoyable, some of the production, which was pretty good, and some of the more introspective moments towards the back end of the album and were welcome despite how cliched some of the lyricism can be. So yeah, it's fine as a whole. I just think Slayyyter really needs to make this sound her own, or at least work to make it hers, I'd say.
Yeah, I agree. I think her 2019 mixtape, Slayyyter, definitely is a unique spin on the whole electropop and hyperpop genre. And some of that uniqueness is present on her album, but unfortunately a lot of very derivative and just very, for lack of a better word, not very unique moments also do show up on this project, just like you said. I think it's very inconsistent. I think some of the tracks here are all over the place and, can never really commit to anyone's sound. They feel kind of like they're half-arsed attempting a bunch of different stuff that Slayyyter doesn't always seem that comfortable on. I think that, the album definitely doesn't get boring at any point. I still, think that there's enough variety in these tracks to definitely make it an easy listen regardless. But there's just very half-baked tracks. There's tracks where the execution just isn't very good. And, while I don't think it's a bad album, and I do think that there's plenty of good moments here that definitely do give reason to be optimistic about the future of Slayyyter's career. I just think that, what's the project? Troubled Paradise doesn't exactly leave enough of an impression to make Slayyyter a household name in the hyperpop scene, just yet. I think she has time to evolve her sound. She has time to make it truly her own. And she just needs to push it a bit more, because I think this project is, which it sounds weird for a hyperpop release, but it sounds a little bit safe.
Yeah. My favourite tracks from Troubled Paradise are, fuck's sake, Throatzilla, Over This, and Troubled Paradise. The worst tracks are Serial Killer, Self-Destruct, and Doghouse, and I gave this album a decent 5.
My favourite tracks are Self-Destruct, Butterflies, and Troubled Paradise. My least favourite track is Cowboys, and I gave this album a decent to strong 5.
Moving on, we have Culture 3 by Migos. This is the 4th studio album from the Atlanta trap giants, Migos, and it's also, of course, the 3rd installment in the Culture albums, and it's supposedly the final album in the series. It's been a while since we've heard from Migos. It's been 3 years since their last album, Culture 2. In the meantime, the group have been dropping their own solo albums and such. None of them were that good, and I was very skeptical going into Culture 3, as the last Culture was way too fucking long, to say the least. And looking at this track list here is worrying because of how long it is and how many tracks are on it, so I was just dreading another helping of the same formulaic shit. The last album wasn't without its highlights and the good production, but it was just ridiculously long, and while Culture 3 certainly isn't as much of a ridiculously long slog to sit through, it still suffers from a lot of the same issues that I had with Culture 2. To start with some positives, I think that Culture 3 has its fair share of good songs and good production, the opening track especially, and the Migos haven't really lost their touch performance-wise, although the chemistry is most certainly off in some cases. Takeoff did well especially, best Migo by the way. But of course, there's a lot of things that hold this album back. For one, it's way too long and it's bloated. The second half of the album is particularly so half-assed that it's insulting and it's so goddamn boring. While I like some of the production, there's so many bland, basic, boring beats throughout this thing that don't complement anything that the Migos are doing because they're just so dull and lifeless. The features are very hit or miss. Some are serviceable, but the others are fine. And finally, the hooks in this album are just often so awkward and half-assed that they end up ruining some of the songs. There's just so little to say about Culture 3 since it just feels like such a half-baked effort from the trio. Like in the past, they've proven that they can make an album full of infectious bangers, like the first Culture, but they've well and proven that Culture was an absolute fluke.
I really agree. I don't know if we'll ever get the same Migos that we got on Culture 1 again. In fact, I think I'm pretty confident that we won't get that Migos again. There's no passion here. It does not sound like there's any passion here. It does not sound like there's any drive here. None of them sound like they're in any way enthused in this almost like hour-plus long record is just filled with 90% just boring, unenthused verses that just absolutely do nothing for me. It just sounds like every single second of this project, every verse was an absolute chore to record. And it definitely feels the same way to listen to this project, in my opinion. It's not even like mindlessly fun like a lot of Migos material is. It's just mindlessly inoffensive and drab. I don't have much else to say about it. It's just a very, very boring album, and one that just does not seem like the effort was put into it. I think that, as you put it well. I think Culture 1 might have been a fluke. It might just have been a fluke.
It well and truly was a fluke. That's all I'm saying.
We'll find out. I could be proven wrong. Maybe they'll release something that isn't a Culture, that is fucking completely mad and insane and exciting, but I don't see that happening.
I don't see that happening either. So, yeah, with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Culture 3 are Avalanche, Type Shit, Malibu, Roadrunner, and What You See. The worst tracks are Handle My Business, Time For Me, Light It Up, Antisocial, Why Not, and Mahamas. And I gave this album a light 5.
My favourite tracks are Avalanche, Antisocial, and Need It. My least favourite tracks are Birthday and Time For Me, and I gave this album a light 4 out of 10.
Next we have The Life of H.E.R. 5 by Bourne. This is the sophomore solo album from producer and rapper Bourne. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are more familiar with H.E.R. as a producer rather than an actual rapper. Most notably, he's produced a lot for Playboi Carti, and in general, I think he's one of the best producers in trap right now. But when it comes to his rapping, H.E.R. is incredibly basic, incredibly underwhelming. Everything is basic about him, from his auto-tuned vocals to his flows, which are just so flat, often boring, and pretty damn rudimentary. And, that was well established on his last album, The Life of H.E.R. 4. With future projects, one would hope that he would improve on that front, and still provide some solid beats, which he does to an extent. But at the end of the day, T-Lop 5 is just an alright project. H.E.R. is definitely coming into his own on The Life of H.E.R. 5 as a performer, and as always, his production is stellar. But some of the same issues that I've had with his previous work turn up on this project. H.E.R. still has the habit of ruining his own beats with some incredibly basic, one-dimensional and half-assed performances, but thankfully those moments aren't as frequent on T-Lop 5, as he's shown improvement on a lot of fronts and often makes these tracks fun with some really catchy melodies. The production feels a lot more varied with its sounds, and it still keeps that very cloudy, atmospheric, and sometimes transcendental vibe that we know H.E.R. for, and of course the track transitions are well executed and give off a sense of cohesion. It has some incredibly stellar tracks to its name, and in general there's a fair amount to take away from the album that's positive, but of course it isn't without its issues. For one, I feel like H.E.R. drags down the quality of the tracks significantly with some of his performances. I feel like he drags some of these tracks out unnecessarily, and the album does not need to be an hour long. H.E.R.'s solo work isn't really built for these lengths since he's just far too uninteresting for it, but we could have a great project on our hands if he just cut the track list down and actually sounded like he was alive half the time. So generally there's things that I really enjoy. I think it's decent overall, but there's definitely some work to be done.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think H.E.R. Bourne, again, shows its potential, but again, stops just short of reaching said potential. But I think by the smallest margin yet on Life of H.E.R. 5. Production-wise, H.E.R. seldom disappoints, and this project is not an exception. In fact, I think the production really does shine on a lot of moments here. It's melodic, it's hypnotic, it's psychedelic, it's exactly what you would want from H.E.R. Bourne production-wise. And in fact, I honestly think it might be his best produced record to date. However, the issues I have with this project, just like his previous releases, arise from the fact that H.E.R just isn't as good of a performer as he is a producer. He sounds too unenthused, too monotone to add to a lot of these tracks. I don't think he's so bad that he takes away from many of them, but there's plenty of tracks where I just feel he's kind of just there, neither adding or taking away from the instrumentals that he has so meticulously crafted. I think if he could polish up on his style, he could honestly, I could picture a H.E.R. Bourne kind of dilate, rodeo-esque, genre-defining album. I could see that as a possibility. I just don't think his performances are there yet. I don't think performance-wise he would be capable of such a thing. Production-wise, no question, but yeah, there's definitely room to improve performance-wise.
Yeah, definitely. My favourite tracks from the life of H.E.R. 5 are 42, Biology 101, Sauceboy 2, Practice, 40 Clip, and Retroville. The worst tracks are Drunk and Nasty and For You, and I gave this album a decent 6.
My favourite tracks are Switching Lanes, 42, Retroville, and For You, and my least favourite tracks are Drunk and Nasty, and I give this album a light 6 out of 10.
Moving on, we have Hall of Fame by Polo G. This is the third full-length album from Chicago rapper Polo G. Now, I've been following up on Polo's career since he first burst onto the scene with his album Die a Legend, which was decent, if a little overhyped. Then the album he released after that, The Goat, was very disappointing, since Polo G has the talent and potential to make a fantastic hip-hop album. But with each consecutive project, he's just been squandering his potential because he's been playing the market and choosing some incredibly basic production with some bloated-out track lists. So going into Hall of Fame I was pretty skeptical and hopeful that Polo G could pull through with a solid record, with something to write home about, but it became clear from the album's opening few minutes that we were in for the same shit with a different name, and Hall of Fame only peaks at the very end of its duration. There's just so little to say about this album, really, except with the fact that it's just such a frustrating listen for me. Given that I see so much potential in this guy, but he's consistently been underwhelming throughout this album's duration, and it doesn't help that he picks some of the most incredibly trite, generic, and repetitive production for every single track. When it comes to some of Polo's performances, he's just very samey throughout the album. His clean and smooth melodic flow is very uninteresting and often quite mind-numbing. He tries to switch things up into a more aggressive sound on some tracks, but they just fall flat and miss the mark completely. A lot of song topics are more or less the same as you'd normally expect from him at this stage. It's more or less the same struggle bars with some brags that add no substance to anything. And the only moment where any of this is compelling is on the final track, which I do genuinely think is fantastic. The production on this album is so boilerplate and generic. It follows a formula, has variations on the same 2 beats, and they just kind of blend together and become a mess of repetitiveness. Not to mention, a lot of the instrumentals are just muddy as hell in some of the mixes, and the bass mix especially on some tracks is grating. It's bloated as hell with 19 tracks, and it runs for 43 minutes, which is just painful when the album is this redundant and generic from front to back. There's just so much unnecessary material on here that just has no point being there, and it's just there to pad out the track list. In summary, Polo G once again plays the market and squanders his potential, and makes such a nothing album for the 3rd time in a row.
Yeah, I'm gonna once again be talking about potential for a 2nd album in a row. A few people would argue that, Polo G doesn't have potential. Few people would argue that Polo G doesn't have potential. I read that out in my notes and I was like, that's not true. Yeah, few people would argue that Polo G doesn't have potential, but also I think few people would argue that this album anyway reaches that potential. He's a very talented performer, and I think his lyrics, while somewhat formulaic, are a lot more coherent than a lot of temporary rappers, and I think he definitely does on occasion pull off a clever one-liner. That being said, Hall of Fame is a digression from the GOAT, for lack of a better word. The instrumentals here are some of the most lifeless I've heard on a rap project in a while. Just 4 bars that loop on repeat with very little semblance of originality or excitement. It's just very boring to listen to, and it's also probably his most poorly written project. The Go had its standout moments, and this album, in my opinion, has one. And you have to wait till the very last track to hear it.
Literally.
Bloody Canvas is a prime example of the aforementioned potential. I think that throughout the album he just doesn't show us the drive, doesn't show us the talent that he does on that final track. There's no reason not to be excited about future Apology releases. I think he's showed enough to know that he is capable. This is just a very half-assed project that doesn't really show us any of that capability, and instead just kind of resorts to tropes and, playing things safe way too often.
I heavily agree with that. My favourite tracks from Hall of Fame are Bloody Canvas and Rapstar. The worst tracks are For the Love of New York, Clueless, Toxic, Epidemic, Boom, Broken Guitars, GNF, Go Part 1, and Losses, and I gave this album a decent 4.
My favourite track is Bloody Canvas, my least favourite track is For the Love of New York, and I gave this album a decent 3 out of 10.
Next we have Ancient Dreams in a Modern Land by MARINA. This is the 5th studio album from the UK pop singer. MARINA is someone who I'm not very familiar with. I've heard her name thrown around on the radio waves over the past decade, but I don't actually think I've ever heard a song from her, and if I have, I've definitely forgotten about it by now. Either way, this new album came out a few weeks ago, and after listening to it a couple of times, it's just whatever for me. There's certainly things that I can appreciate about this record, like some of its relatively catchy production and a lot of Marina's lyrical themes, but as a whole, I just don't find much about this album to be all that captivating or memorable, and even some of the things that I appreciate about it are at varying degrees of quality for me. Like, some of the production on this album just feels so damn predictable and mixed so weakly at points, and while there's certainly catchy moments that I enjoyed on that front, it just sounds very trite to me. Lyrically, a lot of what MARINA goes over is very conscious, political, and well-intentioned, but a lot of it just feels kind of way too on the nose at times, and I would have definitely appreciated some of that if it was a little bit more subtle, but that's just me. But a lot of tracks on this thing just don't fully land with me. I found some of the ballads to be very tedious, and I found the more anthemic tracks to be very rudimentary and kind of predictable. Not a lot of them are memorable in general, and I don't really see myself returning to them. It's just okay pop music all around.
I think it's a new stylistic direction for MARINA, sure, but I think a lot of the ideas and sound explored here, while new for MARINA, are overall a little dated. Maybe it's because I admittedly can't help but think of, the Family Jewels era MARINA whenever I hear her name, but this album just doesn't sound like it was released in 2021. I think none of the ideas are really surprising. Execution-wise, it's all fine. I mean, it's quite inoffensive, but it's fine and gets the job done. But aside from that, I just think there's nothing really spectacular about this outing from MARINA. I don't think it's without merit. I think that there are some bombastic tracks, just like the title track. And, those moments are definitely among the more exciting tracks on the album. But I think as a whole, it doesn't really do that much. I think one thing I will mention is lyrically, I think MARINA does shine. I think a lot of the lyrics here are very mature, very well written, and I think a lot of attention to detail was given to the lyrics over anything else, in my opinion. I don't really know how else to describe this album. It's not bad, but it does kind of feel like I'm getting déjà vu every time I listen to it.
Fair enough. My favourite tracks from Ancient Dreams in a Modern Land are Highly Emotional People, Man's World, New America, and Pandora's Box. My least favourite tracks are Ancient Dreams in a Modern Land, Venus Fly Trap, and Flowers, and I gave this album a decent 5.
My favourite tracks are Ancient Dreams in a Modern Life, I Love You But I Love Me More, and my least favourite track is Highly Emotional People, and I give this album a light 5 out of 10.
Next we have HARAM by GoldLink. This is the 5th studio album from the DC rapper. GoldLink is coming out with this new album 2 years after his last studio effort entitled Diaspora, which I actually thought was a really solid album from him, and it was one of his more eclectic albums. Well, I haven't been keeping up with a lot of GoldLink lately, or really giving his last album that many spins. I suppose it's mostly because of that thing with Mac Miller, but I digress. The new album's out. I've listened to it a few times, and I straight up don't like it. It's probably one of my least favourite albums of the year. Now, there's things that I'll give GoldLink credit for. I think that he stayed pretty eclectic with his sounds as he explores and makes admirable crossovers into some UK drill and hip house. But outside of that, I cannot stand this album. For one, what even is that shitty distorted vocal filter that he decided to use on most of this album. It sounds bad. I can barely make out a word the guy is saying, and it's grating. Even if we take the vocal filter out of the album experience, Haram has nothing noteworthy about it, and all I can really describe it as is an absolute mess. A blatantly unfinished, boring, grating, and flavourless mess. GoldLink himself isn't interesting on this album at all. His delivery is monotone, his flows aren't all that memorable, and the vocal filter, of course, is grating. I don't even know how he heard that and thought that was a good idea to release it to the general public. Like, how? The production on this thing is probably the best thing about it, and it isn't even that good. Most of it is half decent, but they just get so boring as the album goes on, and some tracks even sound blatantly unfinished and half-baked, and the songs at the core just suck because of how the production is utterly trite, colourless, and bland. Like, every time I've tried to listen to this thing, I've gotten a fucking headache. It was that grating, and it was so boring. It's probably one of the worst listens I've had all year, and yeah, it fucking blows.
I think that this new very drilly GoldLink album is not very good at all, but I don't think it's completely devoid of any good qualities. Let's not beat around the bush. I think this album, production-wise, is just so weird and so hard to listen to. There's some tracks that I think the production really does suit, but a lot of the time it just seems wrong, for lack of a better word. It seems wrong. It seems something isn't right. A lot of these tracks are just ridiculously bare bones, and while, you know, the execution, as I said, production-wise, is very half-arsed, very half-baked, I think underneath all of that, I think there is some level of potential. Tracks like Avion or 202 showcase a really relentless and really energetic drill approach that I think the rough production helps to kind of make the tracks feel more raw and more exciting. Unfortunately, those things don't really apply to most of this album. Most of the time, the production just takes away without any positives, really. It's definitely a weird album. I think none of the album fits together really well. I think it feels very choppy. It definitely feels half finished. It's a weird one, for lack of a better word. It's a fucking weird one.
It's also a shit one too, but you know, it's whatever.
I don't think it's good, but I think it's more fucking what the fuck is going on than okay, this is bad.
I was just like, okay, this is bad for the whole duration, not gonna lie. And yeah, my favourite track from Haram is Wild and Lethal Trash. The worst tracks are Spit on It, Twin, Girl Pacino, Thump Chronicles Volume 1, Culture Crush, and Don't Cry Over Spilt Milk, and I gave this album a light 2. Sorry, I couldn't speak there.
My favourite tracks are 202 and Avion. My least favourite tracks are Raindrop, Twin, and Don't Cry Over Spilled Milk, and I give this album a light 4.
Next we have One Foot in Front of the Other by Griff. This is the debut mixtape from UK pop singer Griff. You know, before checking out this tape, I wasn't very familiar with who Griff was, and that's more than likely a given since this is her first mixtape, so the only expectations I really had were that I hoped that she would leave a good first impression on me, and while there's some potential here, this tape is just okay all around. This tape feels more like an EP, if anything, since it's only 7 tracks and runs for only 20 minutes, and with the 20 minutes, I feel like Griff was able to deliver on some tuneful and catchy tracks that work for being something pleasant, and I do enjoy a fair amount of her production on this tape, as it has this very minimalist direction and it stays relatively fun throughout its runtime. But I think a lot of the songs are lacking in a few areas. For one, I feel like vocally, Griff has a long way to go with her vocal style, as it's kind of derivative and very much sounds like her modern contemporaries. And I feel like her songwriting isn't all that interesting and fails to convey much in the way of anything that feels engaging. While I like the production on this thing as well, there are moments that feel a bit bland and at times it can be a bit generic. But hey, there's not a lot to this mixtape aside from that. It's short, but it's a short but sweet helping of pop music, and it certainly does a good job at being that. There's potential here, but we'll just have to wait and see what Griff does next.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Again, Griff's debut album, while at times really enjoyable and with some truly great pop tracks, shows an artist that overall is still trying to develop her identity as an artist. Griff's sound really lacks, any real identity, any real uniqueness. It definitely does feel restrained by a lot of contemporary pop pastiche. And, you know, she truly fails to shine as much like on the rest of the album as she does on moments like Black Hole or Walk. Those tracks definitely suggest that there is a lot more to Griff than just another contemporary pop artist. But I think this album plays things just way too safe. I think if Griff is able to let go of her influences and try some new stuff, I can definitely see a great album on the horizon. But nonetheless, for a debut project, I think this is a good first step in establishing herself, putting her name out there. And, you know, as I said before, tracks like Black Hole and Walk already show that there is a lot more to Griff than meets the eye at first.
Alright, my favourite tracks from One Foot in Front of the Other are Shade of Yellow and Remembering My Dreams. Funnily enough, my least favourite tracks were Black Hole and Walk. And I gave this album a light 6.
My favourite tracks were Black Hole and Walk, and my least favourite track was Heart of Gold. I give this album a decent 5 out of 10.
What a fucking flip around.
That's funny.
Yeah. Next we have Peace or Love by Kings of Convenience. This is the 5th studio album from the Norwegian folk pop and indie folk duo Kings of Convenience, and it's the duo's first album in 12 years. You know, despite how long it's been since the band's last studio effort, I actually haven't gotten a chance to check out any of their material, and this new album here, Peace or Love, is the first thing I'm hearing from them. And usually when I say shit like that, I end up not caring or liking any of the albums. I mean, we literally just talked about the new Sleater-Kinney record earlier, and while Peace or Love doesn't blow me away per se, it's actually quite an enjoyable and likeable bit of folk that has some really sweet and heartwarming highs. You know, it's a very simple record. It doesn't overcomplicate things at all. It's just a very straightforward and warm sounding folk pop album that has some very sweet and endearing moments alongside a nostalgic quality that I really admire and appreciate the album for achieving. You know, it's basically Scandinavian Simon and Garfunkel, and I'm not complaining at all since the album is quality for sure. The melodies and guitar work is pretty great, the vocals and thoughtful songwriting is really good, and the album's warmness is balanced with this additional melancholy that feels prevalent throughout its runtime. Personally, I do feel like the album can be a little too background at times, particularly in the middle of the tracklist, which isn't really as captivating as the first run or the last run, but none of these tracks are even average. In fact, I think every track on here is good and incredibly enjoyable. So yeah, there isn't really much I could say about this album. I just think it's a very good helping of some indie folk, and I took away a fair amount from it.
Kings of Convenience return after 12 whole years, yet the band has just seemingly lost none of their magic over this lengthy break. I think Peace and Love delivers anything you could want from a Kings of Convenience album. It sounds just as amazing as, you know, they've ever sounded. Warm, comforting string arrangements, soft and welcoming vocals, and, you know, very bossa nova inspired undertones all make this one of the best folk releases I've heard this year. The instrumentation here, while very easy on the ears and bare bones, it's still very, you know, very much complex if you kind of give it the attention it deserves. I think there's a lot of moments where the complexity is kind of hidden under the atmosphere and under the serenity of it all. But I think Kings of Convenience definitely, you know, haven't lost their synergy together. I think the two of them still make very great music, and vocally, you know, as always, I can't complain. Eric and Erland always sounded magical together, and this is no exception. I don't know how to explain it other than they just have the most comforting voices imaginable. Also, the Feist features are fucking brilliant. I haven't heard much Feist in a while, so I was happy to hear that voice again. Overall, I mean, it's a return to form. It's almost like they never left.
Okay, my favourite tracks from Peace or Love are Rumours, Rocky Trail, Comb My Hair, Catholic Country, Songs About It, and Washing Machine. My least favourite track is Killers, and I gave this album a decent 7.
My favourite tracks are Rumours, Rocky Trail, Angel, Love Is a Lonely Thing, Fever, Catholic Country, and my least favourite track is Song About It, and I gave this album a decent 7 out of 10.
Alright, next we have Back of My Mind by H.E.R. This is the debut album from the California R&B singer-songwriter. I recognise her from a few of the nominations that she's received at the Grammys, and she's got a few EPs under her name, but this new album in particular is getting pretty significant push from the industry. So it's been pretty heavily promoted with glowing critic reviews and such. It's a big album to say the least, since it's 21 tracks and it runs for an hour and 20 minutes, and it doesn't justify its length. It fucking doesn't. There are things about this album that I do like. For one, I enjoy some of the production. I think that H.E.R is a decent vocalist, and there's a few tracks here that I genuinely do like, but outside of that, Back of My Mind is just too much, since H.E.R's sound is exactly isn't exactly the most consistently engaging or really that original. The squeaky clean production on a lot of tracks renders a lot of the sounds of this album to be very bland and hollow. It just feels very standard and generic modern R&B. It's very tropey. A lot of the tracks in this thing just sound way too breezy and way too low-key. Some of HER's vocals don't seem that interested at all, and oftentimes a lack of interest leads to some dull moments. As far as her writing goes, I don't think she has a unique way of approaching the themes of this album. Other artists in her lane of R&B have done it so much better and in a more compelling way. And this is just way too long, with little in the way of anything that justifies its length. It almost just has okay R&B tunes with only a few highlights, and it seriously drags. Like, I don't dislike this album at all, but I just think it's a nothingness and that goes on for far too long. And this is like the second project like this that we've covered, and I really hope it's the last, because it's a bit much, you know? You know, the fact that the industry pushed this so hard is frustrating as well, and I'm glad that the bullshit is being called out right now, since it just isn't anything to write home about or is anything noteworthy. There's some tracks that I like, but it just doesn't really feel like it's worth your time, you know?
Yeah, H.E.R is certainly talented, and I've yet to hear any material from her that could truly be considered, you know, career or genre defining. Overall, I mean, she's just consistently been decent, consistently, you know, showcased her talents, but without ever really, you know, pushing the envelope or, you know, establishing herself among the likes of SZA or Kaiyote in the contemporary, you know, pop R&B scene. I also, you know, think that while Gabby has, you know, released some decent solo work, I think she lends herself onto, a lot of times she lends herself onto features a lot more. A lot of the most memorable moments I can think of off the top of my head are features. This new project from her, however, I won't beat around the bush. I think it's bad. I think it's painfully bland, and it plays to basically every contemporary R&B trope imaginable. You know, I may as well have heard every single instrumental on here before, and HER's crooning over these tracks doesn't really add anything new. It doesn't really make any of these tracks any more or less exciting. It's just a completely drab mess, and the length of this album just isn't warranted. It becomes tired after the first 6 tracks, let alone having to listen to 21. You know, it's not the first just painfully long, painfully boring R&B album, but you know, it's definitely the one that stands out this year. I don't like it. I do not like it. I have nothing else to say.
Fair enough. I was a bit more lenient on it, but you know, it's whatever. My favourite tracks from back of my mind are Trauma, Bloody Waters, Cheat Code, and I Can Have It All. The worst tracks are Come Through, Lucky, Hold On, and Exhausted, and I gave this album a light 5.
My favourite tracks are We Made It and Bloody Waters. My least favourite tracks are Come Through, Lucky, Paradise, For Anyone, and I Can Have It All, and I give this album a strong 3 out of 10.
Next, we have I Lie Here Buried With My Rings and My Dresses by Backxwash. This is the third studio album from Montreal producer and rapper Backxwash, who has been proving herself to be one of the most interesting and exciting artists that hip-hop has been offering as of late, and that's all because of her solid blends of horrorcore, industrial hip-hop, and trap metal, all of which was exemplified on her last album, God Has Nothing to Do With This, Leave Him Out of It, which I enjoyed. I thought it was a really good album that properly displayed her talents, but I felt like there was something better from her waiting for us down the road. You know, I hope that with this new album, that something would be this project, and big collaborations and production credits from names like Clipping and Code Orange are pretty much indicative of that. You know, unfortunately, this isn't the album that I was hoping to hear from her and the one that would blow me away, but I still think it's very good. Backxwash does a really good job at presenting an intense and unrelenting album experience, as the sound of this thing is incredibly hellish, industrial, and oftentimes just downright demented. The production on this thing kicks ass, and it really helps to elevate the sense of dread and dark atmospheres that the album is going for, and it all manages to stay very enjoyable, and it pretty much leans heavily towards the industrial primary, and it works wonders on plenty of moments here. On the rapping and vocal end of things, Backxwash doesn't disappoint on that front. She delivers on some very charismatic and energetic, but also dark and demented performances with a very good flow and consistently exciting delivery. I also like how gritty, raw, and real she can be in a lot of the album's lyricism, which focuses a lot on very, very rough topics like suicide, gender identity, and racism, all of which are delivered in such an unfiltered and frustrated way. The writing we see a huge step up on this album, definitely. You know, of course, there's plenty of tracks that I love throughout this album's duration, and they only further emphasize what Backxwash is about and what she's capable of. But with that in mind here, I just have one issue. There's just a few tracks in the middle that don't really work for me all that much, and that's mostly down to the production, and some of them is just not really there for me, really. That's it, really. I would say that this is a great album if those select tracks were a little more interesting and consistent, but for what it's worth, I still really fuck with this album. I enjoy a lot of things about it, and I'd say it's up there as one of the more noteworthy hip-hop albums of 2020.
Yep, I agree. Backxwash impressed many with her project. God has nothing to do with it. Leave him out of it last year. But for whatever reason, while not completely blind to its appeal, it didn't quite click with me. It certainly did its job and left me overwhelmed, and I mean that in a good way. And it was very passionately performed, but there was moments where it just didn't really do that much for me production-wise. I think this project turns her sound up a notch in terms of just sheer intensity, and the result is an album so unrelenting, so filled with hatred and pain, and so busy and no nonsense production wise that it feels like an absolute kick in the stomach translated into music. It's similar to her last project, sure. But I think the reason it clicks with me a whole lot more is because it simply feels a little bit more complete. I think it's more well crafted, and let's face it, I think it's a little bit more intense. An intensity which definitely adds to her sound. This new album, I think, is an album that, while I don't think it's the absolute stylistic peak or the creative peak for Backxwash, I think that she's definitely going to be capable of a lot more, especially considering it's very early in her career. I do think that for what it is, it's a very entertaining album. It's a brilliant album, and it's definitely she's definitely kind of ushering a new direction in terms of horrorcore, a new perspective for the genre, and it's exciting, and I'm happy to stick around as a fan.
I'm happy to stick around as a fan too, and my favourite tracks from I Lie Here Buried With My Rings and My Dresses are Wail of the Banshee, the title track, Terror Packets, In My Holy Name, Nine Hells, and Burn to Ashes. And my least favourite track is Blood in the Water, and I gave this album a strong 7.
My favourite tracks are Wail of the Banshee, I Lie Here Buried With My Rings and My Dresses, Song of the Sinners, Nine Hells, and my least favourite track is Blood in the Water, and I give this album a decent 7 out of 10.
Moving on, we have The Revenge of Hobo Johnson by Hobo Johnson. This is the 4th studio album from California singer-songwriter Hobo Johnson. For the past few years, Hobo Johnson has been a pretty polarizing figure in the music world, to say the least. A lot of people like him, a lot of people hate him, and I feel like it's safe to say that I could definitely understand why he can be so polarizing, but for me, I lean more towards the side that likes Hobo Johnson, as I really enjoyed his last album, The Fall of Hobo Johnson, and personally, I think that he gets way more shit than he deserves. Now, with this new album in mind, however, I was very much worried for it, since I didn't really like any of the teaser tracks that I heard, and since it came out, it's been getting shit on. But after hearing it, I definitely think this album is pretty mediocre, but I wouldn't dare say it's bad or that it sucks, since there's things I actually like about the album. Well, the main thing being the lyrics, which sure, some of the tracks have lyrics that are just so cringy, but I like a lot of what Hobo Johnson had to say on this project. He touches on a lot of political issues and his mental health. I agree with a lot of what he has to say on some issues, and I sympathize with him on some tracks. I also found the outro to be kind of funny, but that's really all the positives I have, because I think vocally and instrumentally, the Revenge of Hobo Johnson isn't that great. The instrumentals on this album are so dull, very one-dimensional. You'll essentially just be getting acoustic-driven songs throughout this album with some sequence drum beats sometimes, and they're just dull as hell and way too skeletal a lot of the time. And whenever they aren't skeletal, they're overblown as fuck, often to the point where they're migraine-inducing. Now, what's also migraine-inducing is Hobo Johnson's vocals. I don't think that what he does on this with his vocals is just... Wait, what am I even saying here? Wow, these notes are terrible. Holy shit. Just know, sometimes vocals can be annoying. I don't know if he's trying to go for something that's a little sarcastic on a few tracks, but they just annoy the shit out of me on that merit, and I just can't get into the tracks given how monotonous they can be. Now, there's one track that I do actually really fuck with heavy, but the rest of the album just ranges from okay to mediocre to really bad. And it's a shame because I really don't like shitting on Hobo Johnson. I did enjoy this album for the most part. I liked the writing, but I couldn't get into the music and the vocals. It's disappointing, but at the same time, I can still kind of respect it, even if I don't enjoy it.
Hobo Johnson is a weird artist to talk about. I cannot think of any artist that's, been this divisive over the last few years. A lot of people adore him. A lot of people fucking hate him, like passionately hate him. I don't really stand on either end of the spectrum. I think he's got some genuine potential, especially after hearing and very much enjoying his sophomore project, The Fall of Hobo Johnson. And, some of that potential is showcased on this new project. But on the flip side, his debut also, made it quite clear that he's capable of producing absolute unfiltered cringe. And unfortunately, some of that unfiltered cringe has also made its way onto this new project. I don't know what else to really say here. If you haven't been a fan of Hobo Johnson up to now, then I cannot possibly imagine how this would win you over. If you've enjoyed his style and what he's released, then honestly, I don't see any reason this project wouldn't appeal to fans. But in my opinion, it's kind of stuck somewhere in between his sophomore and debut album, quality-wise. It doesn't seem as... what's the word?
Concise.
It doesn't seem as directionless and sloppy as his main album, but it's also not as focused, not as consistent as his sophomore. It's a weird one. It's not very good, but it's also not awful. And the tracks on here definitely do have a broad spectrum in terms of quality. They range from fucking horrendously bad to actually very good. So, I mean, it's the definition of a mixed bag.
Yeah, I agree. Alright, my favourite tracks on The Revenge of Hobo Johnson, track, is I Want You Back. My least favourite tracks are My Therapist, I Want to See the World, Anton LaVey, and Jordan's House, and I gave this album a strong 4.
My favourite tracks are Anton LaVey and Prequel to Animal Farm. My least favourite tracks are I Want to See the World, I Want You Back, and My Therapist, and I give this album a decent 4 out of 10.
Next we have Call Me If You Get Lost by Tyler, the Creator. This is the 6th studio album from the California rapper, singer, and producer Tyler, the Creator, who at this stage needs no introduction. Tyler is just such a huge artist and one of those artists that pretty much defines the 2010s with his solo work as well as his work with Odd Future. And he's pretty much fresh off of his 2 best albums in my opinion with H.E.R and Flower Boy. By the way, we did a Tyler Worst to Best, you should go watch that, thanks. So with a new album from Tyler, you could bet that I was pretty damn excited since he's been very consistent and convinced me that he doesn't miss. And with Call Me If You Get Lost, he sure as fuck doesn't miss, since this is just fun and a well-deserved victory lap for him. When we compare Call Me If You Get Lost to other albums in Tyler's discography, it features elements that feel like they stem from all across Tyler's discography, like his return to hardcore hip-hop from the roots of Odd Future, the more neo-soul and R&B tinged cuts that feel prevalent in his newer stuff, and some moments here that go over a more introspective route. But this is well and truly a rap album that we haven't heard from Tyler since Wolf or Cherry Bomb. I love the production on this album as well. It's Tyler we're talking about. Of course it's good, but on this album it's especially fantastic. It's very creative, very dense, very layered, and some of the sampling utilized on this album is immaculate. I ascend when tracks like Cold Wind Blows, Manifesto, and What's Your Name come on. Like, those are fantastic to me. Plus, Tyler does his fair share of experimenting and tries new things, like the reggae flip on the second half of Sweet I Thought You Wanted to Dance. All the beats are banging. What more can I say? Tyler himself is consistently great on this album. He's not trying to go with any overarching themes or narratives lyrically. He's simply just having fun rapping his ass off for most of this album, and honestly, this album has some of the best rapping that Tyler has ever laid to tape. On fucking God, he is just pumping out infectious bangers, and I can't really ask for more besides that. He does actually have a few topical moments on tracks like Massa, Manifesto, and Wilshire, which are well written and done well by Tyler, but there's some substance to go with the bangers, of course. The only issues that I have with this album are 2 tracks specifically. Lemonhead, because the 42 Doug feature is mediocre and the beat sounds so cheap, and Wilshire because it's too long and the mixing is awful on headphones. That's it. Besides that, not amazing album, great album, banging production, banging rapping, And I'd say that with the test of time, this will be one of Tyler's more standout and consistent efforts.
Yeah, to me, this project, is definitely, as you said, a victory lap. I don't want to go into too much detail, because people should watch our Worst to Best with Jackson.
Yeah, go watch the Tyler Worst to Best.
Thank you. Now, it's really good.
It's right now.
If you want to hear us talk about this project and more,
Jackson Burns is also on it too. Please watch it.
But to keep things brief, I think that this new project definitely kind of encapsulates some of the magic of a lot of different previous eras of Tyler. It's definitely a little bit more rap oriented in that way. It definitely does kind of see him go back to his roots. There's moments on here that definitely kind of remind me of Wolf. There's moments on here that remind me of Flower Boy. There's even some moments that remind me of H.E.R, but in definitely in smaller capacities. It's definitely a project that is oriented around Tyler and his performances rather than the production. I do think the production is very pristine, very squeaky, very just squeaky clean in a good way. Very, very just meticulous. It sounds fresh. It sounds exciting. It definitely is good to hear Tyler rap again full time, because as good as H.E.R was, a lot of us fell in love with Tyler because of his rapping, and it's good to hear that again. It's definitely it's a fantastic project. It's a crucial one in his career. I think it will go down to be a defining moment in his career down the line. It's definitely going to be one of his better albums. It's great. It's fantastic. And if you love Tyler up to this point, I don't think there's much here that will turn you away from it.
Okay, my favorite tracks from Call Me If You Get Lost are Corso, Lumberjack, What's Your Name, Hot Wind Blows. Is it Cold Wind Blows or Hot Wind Blows? I can't remember. Hot Wind Blows. Manifesto, Sweet I Thought You Wanted to Dance, Sir Baudelaire, and Run It Up. My least favorite tracks are Lemonhead and Wilshire, and I gave this album a light 8.
My favorite tracks are Corso, Lemonhead, What's Your Name, Lumberjack, Mossa, Manifesto, Rise, and Juggernaut. And my least favorite track is Run It Up, and I gave this album a light 8.
Next, we have Home Video by Lucy Dacus. This is the third studio album from Virginia singer-songwriter and member of Boy Genius, Lucy Dacus. When it comes to Lucy Dacus, I've only really been familiar with her work via Boy Genius, and I actually haven't checked out any of her solo work up to this point. But of course, I have been very familiar with Phoebe Bridgers and Julian Baker's work, and I am a fan of both artists, so I had high expectations and hoped that Lucy would present us with a great album. And yeah, I think Home Video is a very good album that features many elements that I love in a singer-songwriter album, and it's very much an enjoyable listen. Of course, what grabbed me the most when it comes to Home Video was a lot of Lucy's songwriting chops, which at times can be nostalgic, and it very much roots itself in an autobiographical style. Plus, the story she tells on tracks like Thumbs and Triple Dog Dare can be incredibly gripping and engaging on that front, and Home Video really thrives in that front anyway. The production on Home Video is arranged and produced very well. A lot of the production that I gravitated towards was more so some of the more atmospheric and dreamier sounds, which are normally backed up by some of Lucy's best songwriting. And generally speaking, the very somber tone of the album is very relaxed, and it allows more space for the songwriting to be more prevalent and front and center. Now, while I didn't really gravitate towards some of the more bare and traditional contemporary folk sounds of this album, they were nice for what they were and still felt right in the context of the album. Where the album falters for me is in the fact that the album doesn't really have a sound that's totally standout in the indie rock or indie pop field. Most of it really could be indistinguishable from a lot of those records, and there's some tracks on this album that don't really have the best songwriting for me personally, and they aren't as gripping or as engaging as some of the absolute best writing on this album. But for what it's worth, I think this is really good. It has some great songs on it, has some incredible moments of songwriting, and it's pretty damn enjoyable.
Yeah, as a massive fan of both Phoebe Bridgers and Julian Baker, it definitely seems a little unfair of me to laud their solo projects, as well as their Boy Genius endeavours, without giving much attention to Lucy's solo material. In fact, this is the first album I'm ever hearing from her, and while I can't say it's not really what I expected, it is pretty much what I expected. It certainly does not disappoint. I think Lucy's sound, while very much kind of similar to Julian Baker and Phoebe Bridgers, especially the latter, it's nothing like, there's nothing here I can complain about. The songwriting is absolutely fantastic. It's definitely one of the album's strong suits. It's very much engaging, as it follows almost a story-esque approach, similar again to that of Phoebe's. And it really manages to go into a lot of detail, exploring really emotionally potent thoughts, without ever really, sacrificing any catchiness, any of the flow of the tracks. It doesn't sound like this is it's definitely very story-based, but it doesn't sound like it's a Phil Elverum track or anything. The flow of the tracks stays consistently just catchy, consistently easy on the ears, and consistently entertaining. Instrumentation also is fantastic. It's very lush, very melancholic, and again, very easy on the ears. A lot of this project is. It's got plenty of exhilarating moments as well. I think out of the Boy Genius trio, I would still probably not rate Lucy as high as I would Phoebe or Julian. And, me saying that her project sounds similar to those two isn't really saying much. I adore both Phoebe Bridgers and Julian Baker, but they're not necessarily doing anything completely new. They're just really well executing their own twists on already existing genres and styles, which I think Lucy is doing here as well. I think her work, this is good enough to put her work, in my opinion, kind of in the same league as her contemporaries and previous collaborators. I very much enjoy this project. It's one of my favorite of the month, and I'm looking forward to maybe explore Lucy's back catalogue. I think I definitely should, and I'm gonna keep an eye out for any new material. Boy Genius reunion when?
Yes, please, lads, come on. Or never mind. My favorite tracks from home video are Christine, Thumbs, Hot and Heavy, Cartwheel, Going Gone, and Triple Dog Dare. My least favorite tracks are VBS and Please Stay, and I gave this album a decent 7.
My favorite tracks are Hot and Heavy, First Time, VBS, Partner in Crime, Triple Dog Dare, and Brando. My least favorite track is Cartwheel, and I gave this album a strong 7 out of 10.
Next we have Disco by Mike. This is the 7th studio album from New Jersey rapper Mike. Mike is someone that we've covered before on the podcast, and the album that we covered from him previously was his last album, Weight of the World, which has grown off me with recent listens, admittedly, but I still think it's a good and interesting album from him that featured some textured production and some really thought-provoking and introspective lyricism. Going into this album, I was just hoping that Mike would be able to make an album that feels much more fleshed out and conveyed a new mood while still holding on to that interesting production choices and introspection that he displayed prior. And it's safe to say that I do like this album, and I do think that Mike is trying to go for a different mood with his production, but in many ways it's pretty much like his last album in a lot of respects. To me, structurally and fundamentally, Disco is very similar to Mike's previous album, and while it can feel a bit deja vu at points, it ultimately doesn't bother me majority of the time, as I really enjoyed what Mike had to offer in terms of production and rapping. Disco is very much in line with this very jagged, abstract hip-hop production, and once again, I found myself loving a lot of the layers and hypnagogic pop-inspired textures and jagged sampling that was found in the production, and I think that Mike was trying to convey a tone that feels much more bright and carefree in a lot of cases, and it still holds on to the abstract lyricism and stumbling sort of awkward flow that we know him for. He implements his flow into these beats very well, and I respect a lot of the introspective lyricism. I do feel like the album does have an issue with its consistency and a lot of tracks feeling very underwhelming. There's plenty of tracks that I think are great, or at the very least good throughout this album's duration, but Mike's fair share of tracks are just kind of half-baked, and those tracks kind of left little impact on me and kind of wobbled the flow of the album. Besides that, I do find myself enjoying this album. I think that Mike takes his sound into a solid direction given its production style, and while it may be very similar to his previous records, I still have plenty of tracks that I enjoyed from it.
Yeah, I was quite a big fan of Mike's 2020 album, Weight of the World. It was one of the most interestingly produced and tightly performed rap albums of the last few years. The production on that project, while largely sample-heavy, remained very atmospheric, very subtle, and almost haunted sounding. The dark atmosphere is really what gave so much weight and emotion to the performances and the songwriting on that project as well. This new project, Disco, while still just as sample-heavy as its predecessor, I think is far less subtle with its sampling. I think the samples aren't incorporated quite as well, and I think this eliminates a lot of the atmosphere that was on Weight of the World. You know, it kind of just moments on this album that almost sound Griselda-esque with its sample work. It's very flamboyant, very just vibrant, very lush. It's good, but I mean, it's kind of good for a different reason than, you know, Weight of the World was good. And personally, I just think Mike's sound, Mike's flows, Mike's energy definitely suits his previous style a little bit more. That being said, I don't think the projects are too dissimilar. You know, when you're looking to dissect them, sure, there are some very clear differences, but overall, I mean, I still think both projects are good. I still think this project has very good material on it. I just think it's not quite, I think, playing to Mike's strengths.
All right. And have we at least mentioned Griselda once every recap? Has that
Probably.
happened?
I mean, let's be fair. This is probably the first recap we've ever done where Griselda haven't released a project.
That's actually true. So
good job,
we have
Griselda. To mention them somehow.
Good job, Griselda. But we still had to mention.
Good job.
You
taking a break. They're going to release 6 next month.
Oh god, here we go. Okay, so with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Disco are Alarmed, Ghoulish, Endgame, World Market Mo Money, Crystal Ball, Sandra, Airdrop, and Spiral Disco. My least favourite tracks are Leaders of Tomorrow and Frogville MK Ultra, and I gave this album a decent 7.
My favourite tracks are Evil Eye, Awe, Baby Villain, and Spiral Disco. My least favourite track is Frogville, and I give this album a light 6 out of 10.
Alright, next we have Planet H.E.R by Doja Cat. This is the third album from rapper and singer Doja Cat. You know, at this stage, Doja Cat doesn't really need much of an introduction since she's been massive over the past couple of years, so much so that oftentimes she's pretty inescapable. And while there have been certainly songs that I really liked from her, I've never really found her to be an interesting artist overall. I find her to be pretty derivative of other artists in her lane, and I don't really see what she brings to the table aside from making the hit or song or two. With Planet H.E.R, I'm struggling to even come up with things to say about it because this is just such a whatever project filled with mostly whatever material. You know, there are tracks and songs that I do think go off and are generally the most fun and catchy songs on the album, but those moments are very scarce on Planet H.E.R because a lot of it is just inoffensive and pretty uncreative. It may as well be called Planet Yawn because it was that boring. The production throughout Planet H.E.R is just very sterile, squeaky clean, and it's kind of overproduced. It's like I'm consuming plastic whenever I'm going through the album. You know, Doja Cat herself is often flip-flopping between being very uninteresting and boring to straight up grating, or for lack of any better words, annoying, because her vocals and some of her inflections are just so painful. Now, there isn't really much else that defines this album or makes it worth talking about, really, since it's just an incredibly mediocre pop rap album. Nothing more, nothing less.
I agree. I think Doja Cat is certainly one of the most interesting figures in pop music today, and you know, she's certainly capable of making absolute bangers. Unfortunately, I think she does play things quite safe far too often. This new album is absolutely no exception. I think Doja Cat has potential to be a lot more than just another pop rapper. I think she's got the personality for it. I think she's got the charisma for it. And I do think she's got the talent for it. But so far in her career, it just feels like instead of exploring any new ideas and fully polishing her projects, she fills them with just filler-esque pop rap with little to no real substance, aside from the occasional memorable hook or one-liner. It's not really a great project. She's capable of more, but this is just generic pop rap, for lack of a better word.
Yep. My favourite tracks from Planet H.E.R are Kiss Me More, Been Like This, and Payday. My least favourite tracks are Get Into It, Yeah, Need to Know, Love to Dream, and Ain't Shit, and I gave this album a light 4.
My favourite tracks are Payday and Kiss Me More. My least favourite track is Woman, and I give this album a light 4 out of 10.
Next we have The Turning Wheel by Spelling. This is the third studio album from California art pop singer-songwriter Spelling. And Spelling is another artist who I'm not familiar with, and The Turning Wheel is my first album, the introduction to her. But I've been pretty hyped to hear this one since the buzz around it has been pretty positive, and a few days ago it got the big 10 from the Melon himself, so that's huge. Now I'm going to give it more listens down the road, but on first listen I can safely say that it's good. I do like it. It's got a lot to admire about it, but it also has some things that don't work for me. You know, to start with some positives, I think that the sound of this album is fantastic, especially when it comes to the incredibly lush and immaculately produced art pop sound. Like, Spelling dabbles in a lot of sounds on here that are often very intricate, Detailed, psychedelic, and often progressive. The arrangements and compositions are top-notch on a lot of the tracks here, especially the string arrangements. A lot of the progressive and art rock sounds of this album definitely feel like they take a little influence from Kate Bush, and some of the darkwave aspects in the album are really interesting in some of the mixes. Now, Spelling's vocals are certainly interesting in how out there they can be. At the same time, her voice is often pretty beautiful and matches the mood and aura of some of the production. And you can even hear that Kate Bush influence on her vocals too, but in a way I feel like Spelling makes it her own, and she definitely does an incredible job of, performing and making some absolutely incredible tracks on here. And it helps that a lot of her songwriting is pretty great too. The Turning Wheel has plenty of fantastic art pop jams in the tracklist, but where the album is great in making some really lush tracks, I feel like it falters in its inability to maintain an engaging and consistent pace, since I feel like there's a fair amount of songs in this record, especially on the second half, that aren't all that great. The ones that don't do it for me in particular are the ones that lean more heavy on the progressive side on the latter half, and they don't really flesh themselves out into anything that's really all that gratifying or interesting in terms of arrangements or composition. But hey, for what it's worth, The Turning Wheel is a good album. Admittedly, I haven't given it enough listens to form a concrete opinion, but on first listen, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, Spelling's new album offers plenty to admire. At its best moments, it's an incredibly lush and whimsical journey, immaculately produced and written in very, very memorable and attention-demanding fashion. And it's certainly a step in a more admirable and sonic direction when compared to her 2019 project Mazy Fly, which just didn't really click with me. But when this project clicks, it really, really clicks. But while I do think that this album is just so textured and grandiose that multiple listens are almost a must to really be able to fully process everything this project throws at you, I think that even after multiple listens, there's just moments here that don't really click with me, especially in the latter half, which just isn't all that consistent. Don't get me wrong, tracks like Little Deer and Boys at School are abso-fucking-lutely beautiful, and some of the highlights of the year so far, but tracks like Magic Act or Sweet Talk just don't feel anywhere near as captivating or pristine, and it just kind of feels wrong to call an album with some of the amazing moments that The Turning Wheel has just good. But I think the stretches of moments that don't particularly interest me, and the fact that this album also does drag on a little bit for me, do bring this project down a few notches. And unfortunately, I can't say much more about this album than it's good.
Alright, my favourite tracks from The Turning Wheel are Little Deer, Always, Turning Wheel, The Future, Awaken, Emperor with an Egg, Legacy, Revolution, and Sweet Talk. My least favourite tracks are Boys at School and Queen of Wands, and I gave this album a decent 7.
My favourite tracks are Little Deer, Always, Turning Wheel, Boys at School, Revolution, and Awaken. My least favourite tracks are Emperor with an Egg, Magic Act, and Sweet Talk, and I gave this album a strong 6 out of 10.
Alright, we're moving on to the final two albums that we're going to be talking about, first of which is Mood Valiant by Hiatus Kaiyote. This is the long-awaited third studio album from the Australian neo-soul act Hiatus Kaiyote. Now, this is the band's first album after 6 years, and before this album I've only heard a handful of tracks from them, and I've mostly been indifferent towards those select tracks I've heard, so I didn't really have much expectations going into this new album. But for what it's worth, I think Mood Valiant is a decent album that has its moments, but ultimately it isn't anything too impressive. Now, the tracks that stand out to me the most are definitely the ones that feature a more energetic and fun atmosphere. Most of those are at the front of the album, while they certainly don't really show us much of a unique spin on the neo-soul sound. They do well with some energetic and fun tracks and psychedelic instrumentation. But where Hiatus Kaiyote lose me is in the second half of this album, which is much more slower paced and groove heavy. But honestly, these tracks really don't do much for me because I find them to be pretty dull and honestly boring as shit, and they drag on. The production on these tracks is just not that interesting. There's little to no flavour in the sound, and they were just very tedious and monotonous to sit through. I haven't got much else to say about this album, really. I don't think it has much in the way of anything that's all that unique, but I still do enjoy a fair amount of the first half.
Yeah, I mean, I think the neo-soul sound of Mood Valiant lends itself to some truly spectacular moments, especially when the album is at its most busy and eclectic. But I have to admit that there's plenty of material on this project that does a whole lot of nothing for me personally. There's plenty of tracks here that seem a little sloppy, a little poorly produced, and not all the compositions really stand out to me as particularly unique or exciting or even well put together. Great moments are still worth checking out for, but I think there's a little too much material here that I can't help but be indifferent towards. And although there's definitely highlights. The track Chivalry Is Not Dead is absolutely fantastic. The track Red Room is just one of the best tracks I've heard this month. And, unfortunately, the album is kind of brought down by some of its more sloppy, some of its more inconsistent moments. And overall, I think it's decent, but nothing more.
Alright, my favourite tracks from Mood Valiant are Get Sun, Sip Into Something Soft, Chivalry Is Not Dead, and We Go Gentle and All the Words We Don't Say. My least favourite tracks are Red Room, Sparkle Tape Breakup, Stone or Lavender, and Blood and Narrow. And I gave this album a light 6.
My favourite tracks are Chivalry Is Not Dead, All the Words We Don't Say, and Red Room. My least favourite track is Blood and Marrow, and I give this album a strong 5 out of 10.
Okay, let's move on to the final album that we're going to be talking about today, and we're going to be talking about The Golden Casket by Modest Mouse. This is the 7th studio album from the legendary indie rock band Modest Mouse. Modest Mouse are pretty much a household name when it comes to indie rock. This band is responsible for some of the best indie music of all time, with albums like The Lonesome Crowded West, The Moon in Antarctica, and Good News for People Who Love Bad News. I love this band, they're definitely up there for me as one of my favourites, but their newer music hasn't been that great, to say the least. Their last album, Strangers to Ourselves in particular, is my least favourite Modest Mouse album, but up to this point, the singles for this album haven't been very good. So I was very hesitant going into The Golden Casket, and after listening to it a few times, I think that just might be my least favourite Modest Mouse album. Now, this doesn't mean that I think The Golden Casket is awful, it's far from it, but I just find this album to be one of the band's most grating and patience-testing albums. There's some good and well-written tracks in the album, definitely, but in moments like Lace Your Shoes and Back to Middle, but there's way too many songs in this album that are either uninteresting or just straight up bad to me. The sound of this album is heavily basing itself in this indie pop and neo-psychedelic setting, and while these attempts are admirable, a lot of them don't go over that well, as I find a lot of the ideas to be poorly executed, and I really don't like the mixing on this album. Like, the production is so sloppy. The drums and vocals are way too loud in the mix, and the heavy synth-based atmospheres sound way too wishy-washy. Though the instrumentation just feels so cluttered and messy, it's like the band wanted to cram as much as they could into one thing just because they could, and the songs themselves are just really bland, forgettable, and uninteresting. Isaac Brock's vocals are normally what I love the most about Modest Mouse albums, but on here it just seems like the more clean pop rock centered vocal style he's trying to go for just isn't going over that well, and the tracks here that feel more effect heavy don't do him any favours at all. Compositionally, these tracks are just so tedious and lack much in the way of anything exciting, and there are moments on this album that are just so weird and they just feel so out of place for me. I don't know, man. Like, what the fuck? So, yeah, this is pretty mediocre and pretty damn disappointing. This isn't really that great, and it's disappointing considering I really love Modest Mouse, but this is really just the nail in the coffin for the Modest Mouse discography.
Yeah, for sure. I really don't understand what Modest Mouse are trying to do at this point. Let's face it, a return to form from the band is starting to seem kind of unlikely. They've taken a several-year-long break, the second time in a row now, and both times they've come out with albums that are just so vapid, so underdeveloped, and so tasteless, that it's hard to really be optimistic about the band in the current year. I still think, as musicians, they're definitely gonna be capable of doing something better, but I just don't know if the passion, if the drive, or if the right ideas are really there. The Golden Casket, bar 2 great tracks, is honestly just like, what the fuck is going on here? It makes the band's better material almost seem like a fluke, which obviously it's not. There's been more good material than bad material, but it's just hard to see, the band that we once remember, the band that released The Lonesome Crowded West, the band that released The Moon in Antarctica, and it's hard to listen to tracks like Fuck Your Acid Trip and, think of the same band, but it's the same band, but the ideas here, the things they attempt are just sometimes unfathomably bland, sometimes just to put it bluntly, obnoxious. I still think this isn't unsalvageable levels of bad. I think that underneath some of the shit ideas and poor executions, there's still a semblance of Modest Mouse that I can hear on tracks like We're Lucky or Back to the Middle. It's just this. It feels like it's confused. It feels like it doesn't know what it's doing. It's a mess, for lack of a better word. It's a complete and utter mess, and I do think it's the worst Modest Mouse album to date.
Also, we did a Modest Mouse Worst to Best a few months ago. You should go watch that, thanks.
Yeah, for sure, man.
Yeah, my favourite tracks from the Golden Casket are Walking and Running, Lace Your Shoes, and Back to the Middle. And my least favourite tracks are The Sun Hasn't Left, Never Fuck a Spider on the Fly, Wooden Soldiers, Transmitting, Receiving, Leave a Light On, and Japanese Trees. And I gave this album a light 4.
My favourite tracks are We're Lucky and Back to the Middle. My least favourite tracks are Fuck Your Acid Trip and Leave a Light On. And I give this album a light 4 out of 10.
Okay, we've talked about all the albums that we want to. Let's move on to the worst albums, best albums, and songs of the month. So I think we'll start with the worst albums. For me, my number 3 for the worst albums was The Golden Casket by Modest Mouse.
I'm just scrolling down. Mine was Doja Cat, Planet Her.
My number 2 was Planet Her, Doja Cat.
My number 2 was Polo G, Hall of Fame.
And my number 1 was Haram by GoldLink.
My number 1 was H.E.R, Back of My Mind.
Alright, moving on to best albums. My number 5 was The Turning Wheel by Spelling.
My number 5 was Backxwash, I Lie Here Buried with My Rings and My Dresses.
My number 4 was Peace or Love by Kings of Convenience. I had Jubilee there instead. I don't know how that happened.
My number 4 was also Piece of Love by Kings of Convenience.
My number 3 was Jubilee by Japanese Breakfast.
My number 3 was Lucy Dacus, Home Video.
My number 2 was I Lie Here Buried with My Rings and My Dresses by Backxwash.
My number 2 was Tyler, the Creator, Call Me If You Get Lost.
My number 1 was Call Me If You Get Lost by Tyler, the Creator.
My number 1 was Japanese Breakfast, Jubilee.
Nice one. And now we're going to move on to our best songs of the month. I have about 4 honourable mentions here, some of which we haven't covered, some of which weren't on any albums this month. I want to mention the song Q from the most recent Poppy EP. I thought that was great. I want to mention the single Headshots for the Locals by Isaiah Rashad. Cannot wait for that album. And moving on to the album mentions, Posing in Bondage by Japanese Breakfast and Nine Hells by Backxwash. But my best song of the month is Corso by Tyler, the Creator.
My best song of the month wasn't really close, but I do have some honourable mentions that I do want to throw in there. First of all, Griff, Black Hole. I want to give a shout out to Boys at School by Spelling. I also want to give out a shout out to That Funny Feeling by Bo Burnham from his new special.
Oh yeah.
And / kind of his new album. Doja Cat with Payday was also brilliant. Lucy Dacus with Hot and Heavy was brilliant. Japanese Breakfast with Paprika was also a fantastic track, but hands down my favourite track of the month, possibly like a top 3 favourite track of the year, it was Be Sweet by Japanese Breakfast.
Nice.
Probably the most infectious and just, I don't know, it's one of the best tracks I've heard all year.
Corso is one of my favourite bangers of the year. Like, that track goes the fuck off. Okay, so...
Tyler, I actually completely skimmed over Tyler, but it's hard to pick a favourite track on that new one. I'd probably give it to Masa as my favourite track off the new Tyler album. I'll also give that an honourable mention. I completely forgot somehow.
Okay. And yeah, with that in mind, we did it. We talked about everything we needed to talk about today. Thank you guys so much for checking out today's album recap. What were some of your favourite albums of June? What were some of your least favourite albums of June? Let us know. Be sure to check out some of our previous podcast episodes, and be sure to check the necessary links in the description to our own channels, to our Twitter, to our own Album of the Year and Rate Your Music pages. And yeah, I've been Mickey T.
I've been Nostalgia.
Peace.
Peace, man.